finance for, especially early stage finance for climate entrepreneurs is challenging in India. Financing for entrepreneurs in general is challenging globally, but more so in India.
We need more domestic capital to come in at the earlier and get more capital into the earlier stages. We need global capital to kind of come and support CSA and beyond. And then, of course, we need, as we mentioned earlier, growth capital, whether it's private equity, public markets, or bond markets, etc. So I think these 3-4 things: talent moving in, late stage allocators sending signals, early stage allocators pumping in more risk capital, the case for industrial decarbonization becoming stronger. I think, and of course, the enabling policy frameworks that are getting into place. I also
an Indian, when I look at what India was 10 years ago and what it is today, I think several pieces of the puzzle have already fallen together, right? You've had decent, so at a macro level, you've had decent political stability for the last 2 terms of the current government, but so important, which we overlook. You just have to look at countries at war, Ukraine, for example, and how can you talk about any entrepreneurship without political stability, social stability? So I think that's very important.
So, Akhilesh and Nalin, welcome to the Climatepreneur Show. Today, basically, we are actually discussing this great report that has been, co-authored through Climate Trends and Climate Dots, titled Climate Finance for Startups in India: Key Challenges, Opportunities and Recommendations to Foster a Vibrant Climate Tech Environment in the Country. And, the combination that we today have with both of you, actually, I think is pretty interesting to discuss the report, because Nalin has been in the climate tech and the clean energy industry for the past decade, and is also the founding partner of the Climate Seeds Fund, which is a venture fund set up to create a curated index of investments in early stage climate tech startups in South Asia. And Akhilesh, you really are the founder of Climate Dot, a think and act research organization committed to accelerate the energy transition and adoption of sustainable technology. So Akhilesh, I really want to start with you, and really want to start with that. Why did you write this report actually, and why did you put the kind of hard work and the effort to write this report? Why the report is relevant today?
Because there's a need in the market. Simple one-line answer, right? We've been in this space for quite some time, and in general, startups in India have really taken off over the last 10 years or so. But climate entrepreneurs in particular find it far more challenging compared to an IT, making an app or e-commerce or something like that. So we really, Nalin is in the space, I'm in the space. So we really saw the need, and we thought that this is the right time to write the report.
And Nalin, what do you think, why do you think from your angle that the report today is super important and it's something that we should really consume?
I mean, of course, all such reports are very useful. This is very timely and really focuses on key actionable insights that perhaps both policymakers, entrepreneurs, investors can take. So we, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, I think climate change is not going to wait for anyone. We need urgent solutions. So we need many more people to come into the space, much more research. And what Akhilesh and his team have done is a good first step along that pathway.
Definitely. So Akhilesh, what have been some of your key findings from the report?
Yeah, I think if you go through the report, you'll know that finance for, especially early stage finance for climate entrepreneurs is challenging in India. Financing for entrepreneurs in general is challenging globally, but more so in India. But for those entrepreneurs trying to solve climate change, climate specific topics, it's even more acute. Mainly, as I said earlier, because it's not as simple as building an app or building a marketplace or something like that. Most of these companies, these innovations tend to be products with an actual physical reality, or working very closely with government, with regulators, and so on. So it's a completely different ball game, right? And so there is indeed a problem which we need to address. I think that's a key highlight. Then, of course, there are several other recommendations, several other findings, which we can, of course, go through during the course of this interview.
Great. And for our listeners and viewers, I'll be attaching the link to the report in the description, so you guys can refer the report there. So Nalin, coming to you, I really want to understand from you first that what do you think is the role of climate startups in the Indian economy, and why does it make it so much relevant to look at the climate startups and this entire ecosystem today?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question, and there's so many things one needs to do, and so many stakeholders need to come together. But startups have an outsized role to play, and that's our belief. So there's two things that really bring this to light, right? So there's research done by the International Energy Agency, I think a year or two ago, which showed that about 75% of the technologies that are needed to get us to net zero between 2050 and 2070, 75%, 3/4 of those are still in early stages. So they're not commercial. They're either in prototype phase or even design phase, etc. Right? All of those need to be built into viable, commercial, deployable products at scale. Right? What we know from experience, modern society's experience over the last 150 years through the Industrial Revolution, is that innovators, and increasingly what we define as startups, they have a great ability to take invention, oftentimes lab scale, right, and innovate, make them into products that are usable and deployable at scale, right? Innovators and startups have the best ability to do this. Of course, corporates do that. Sometimes researchers do that, but no one does it as well as what we call today startups, right? And that's the role. Knowing that 75% of what is needed is still in the development phase, knowing that the best kind of category of people who can do this are innovators, that match needs to happen quickly. And there is the reason why we need to support climate startups.
And what role do you think that climate finance plays in that transition or in that support? And do you also think that climate finance is today one of the biggest opportunities of our times?
So climate finance obviously is a broad term, and finance is across various stages, right? So that's the first recognition, is that we need early stage risk capital, we need mid-stage growth capital, and then of course more commercial public market capital and the more deepening of the bond markets, right? So it's across, right? And then there's the origin of capital, right? Do we need more cross-border capital, international climate finance, what we know as international climate finance? Technology transfer is also part of that, often linked to each other. But let's here focus on startups, and let's here focus on early stage finance, right? So risk capital, of course, by the way, it's relatively new as far as things go. It's probably a few decades old, especially venture capital. So we need definitely much more risk capital to come into the space, right? So we've kind of defined why it's necessary to support innovators and startups, and what supports the growth is clearly this kind of risk capital, right? Now within early stage also there's the really early stage pre-series A, and then you have series A and beyond, right? Now what we've seen is pre-series A capital is largely domestic, right? Because the risks are more. A lot depends on the team, a lot depends on the understanding of the market and timing, right? And domestic investors are generally better placed to take bets at the pre-series A stage. Series A and beyond, capital gets much more mobile across borders, right? So you've seen more global funds that are series A and beyond, and certainly series B, series C, but the earlier stage funds are largely domestic. So we need more domestic capital to come in at the earlier and get more capital into the earlier stages. We need global capital to kind of come and support series A and beyond. And then of course we need, as we mentioned earlier, growth capital, whether it's private equity, public markets or bond markets, etc.
Akhilesh, what would you say on that? Like, what role do you think that, financing plays at various stages of climate startups?
I agree with Nalin. Extremely critical. There's no doubt about it, right? One, just as an addition, I think one must remember that the entire startup culture in India is relatively new. So it's something that we're seeing over the last 10, 15 years, Nalin, correct me if I'm wrong. It's a cultural shift in people's aspirations, right? Especially younger people today don't see the get a job, get a secure job, especially the upward mobile classes. They're really looking for new, challenging, meaningful work, and certainly ways to get rich very quickly. So there's a lot of aspirations. You just go to any, master's and a technical college, and you talk to a lot of the students. Most of them are sort of working on some startup or the other. I think that cultural shift generally comes first, and then of course the ecosystems are now significantly developing around these cultural factors. So I think going ahead we'll see much more of this.
And also, like this is one part I was talking to you, Akhilesh, earlier about this as well, that in the report I really found that, you actually mentioned that the total climate tech investment in 2021 was estimated to be around USD 20 billion US dollars, sorry. However, the funding has largely been limited to two sectors, that was renewable and EV. And you also mentioned that, however, this is changing. So I want to really understand from you that yes, we need funding in renewable, yes, we need funding in EV, but what do you mean when you say yes, it's changing? And what are the other sector you feel right now are not in the spotlight and should be in the spotlight?
A great question, right? So because we're addressing the climate, we're addressing specifically the problem of climate change.
Yep.
Look at where our India's emissions come from. Majority of it, over 75%, is from the energy sector. So great innovations in the energy sector are needed. Of course, the low-hanging fruits have been the electricity production sector, which is moving electricity away from coal and gas, coal predominantly in India, to renewables. Great thing is renewables as a technology have matured significantly since the early 2000s, right? India has built all its capacity today, what you see, 100 odd gigawatts of capacity in the last 10 years. That is significant. So the power sector, the transition of the power sector is something that's happened, and it's very mature. But other sectors, their emission is significant. The waste sector, one that comes to the top of my mind, is extremely unorganized and requires tremendous efforts. Not much, in my view, has been done to organize the waste sector. That's one example. EVs is, of course, a recent phenomena, right? The last 3 or 4 years. And we'll see tremendous innovations, tremendous amount of entrepreneurs trying to solve EVs. It's already happening. Today, if you go to any incubator, accelerator program, there's some EV company trying to do something on charging, swapping, building a new two-wheeler, or doing some service. So a lot of innovation happening even in the EV sector. But there are several other sectors. Agriculture is one of those, is a white elephant. Not much has happened in the agricultural sector to decarbonize it. But you also have agrotech startups coming in. So
Yes.
I see this as we're on the threshold of something wonderful going to happen hopefully in the next few years, in the next decade or so. And as Nalin said, it needs to happen much faster. And I think that's why we're here. That's why we're trying to put our minds together to come up with some interesting solutions.
So, Nalin, as Akhilesh mentioned that it needs to happen faster. I want to really understand from you, how do you think it can happen faster, and what are the changes that you feel should be done? For example, today, if we have like one climate fund, should we like really demarcate it? Okay, that 10% goes to this, or like how do we actually make those statistics, and how do we actually, like for example, delegate these funds to different causes under the climate sector only?
Right. I think there's a few questions in that single question you asked, but in terms of so I think like Akhilesh, I think all of us believe in the power of the markets, right? Of the free markets. They have an organizing power that is beyond any central planning ability, right? Let me talk about a few trends that we're already seeing that are happening, right? And these are signals, for example, that are being sent across the value chain, right? So around when the COVID pandemic hit, of course there was a lot of disruption in capital flows, etc. But increasingly what we found, there was a reallocation of capital, right? So a lot more capital started flowing into climate because it turned out, I mean, not as much as we would like, but still we saw greater flows, right?
Yep.
Late stage capital allocators, BlackRock, Temasek, all these guys, BlackRock, Temasek, all these guys started making ESG a default, putting more capitals, committing to TCFD and other kinds of disclosure standards, etc. Right? So late stage capital allocators send signals upstream, right? So we slowly had more, actually I say slowly, but in fact quite rapidly had more early stage capital providers also getting into the fray. VC capital or venture capital funding started increasing in this space, right? Now people, this is again anecdotal, so I don't have evidence like data-based or empirical evidence for this, but a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs that we support came to us, and when we asked them what motivated them, a lot of them had introspected during the pandemic, and what they found was they wanted to focus on something that had more meaning in their lives. They wanted to align their values with what they were doing at work, right? A lot of them got into climate, a lot of them got into education, health, and many other useful things, I mean, everything is useful, but what I mean is what was useful for them, and certainly for the world at large. So a lot of good entrepreneurial talent, a lot of good job seekers got into the space, and we are seeing more of that, right? So we are seeing data for that. This part we are seeing data. What I meant anecdotal was the earlier bit, the reasons for doing this. So nothing kind of moves the needle in any sector as much as good talent coming in. You have to recognize that it's often a chicken and egg situation. So investors are waiting for right talent to come in. Talent wants to be in the sector where there's funding available, not just early stage, but all kinds of early, late stage funding. So these two things happened in concert and are still continuing to happen. We need more. So entrepreneurial talent moving in, investors backing entrepreneurial talent, policies also coming into place. At last count, I forget, we've done this research, but there's a fair few policies in India that are, of course, we know the energy, kind of clean energy, capacity augmentation policies and the open access policies. But increasingly, of course, we're seeing mobility policies, and we're seeing carbon sink policies. Increasingly, we'll see carbon capture coming in. So policies will also lead to greater opportunity, right? I think the final key thing is that what has happened. So today, 2/3 of the world's population lives in regions where the cheapest form of energy generation is renewable. It's either wind or solar typically, right? So this is a shift that is relatively recent, right? But extending from this, because energy forms such a critical part of any cost structure of an industry. Today, the business case for decarbonization is very strong, right? And to have a decarbonized supply chain, there's no doubt. It really affects positively your bottom line. It also kind of makes you a much better brand for consumers to kind of associate with, right? And thereby, the public markets as well. So I think these 3-4 things: talent moving in, late stage allocators sending signals, early stage allocators pumping in more risk capital, the case for industrial decarbonization becoming stronger. I think, and of course, the enabling policy frameworks that are getting into place. I also feel like state level policies. And states have a great opportunity here to be leaders. It's not just the central level policies. I mean, of course, if you look at HDI indicators and per capita levels across states, there's a wide variation. Yes. I mean, some states do extremely well, and those are the states which have a great opportunity. Even the other states, actually, this is a great growth opportunity for every state in India. So I think these 4-5 things are the trends that we see that need to accelerate. The last thing is there's a lot of good research. There's actually 2 more things. There's a lot of good research that is perhaps locked up today. I don't mean locked up in a bad way. It's just not been commercialized across many think tanks and academia, right? So there needs to be commercialization pathways for this kind of research. And finally is something that perhaps we all recognize, is that there's a large section of India's population that is underrepresented in the workforce, which is women, right? And there's a great opportunity in our climate or a clean economy transition to kind of address that skewness or imbalance and get more women entrepreneurs to be part of this. So I think these 4, 5, 6 things are probably where we feel we can focus best
I
on.
strongly agree on that. And to back up, like give it back to your point, all the points that you mentioned, I have examples for that. The research thing you mentioned, I recently connected with someone who's actually said the same thing, that we need some funds at the research level that helps these maybe students, maybe researchers to actually take this from a stage of research to commercialization. Then women
Right.
thing, Switch Mobility, so Mahesh Babu from Switch Mobility actually mentioned that a women bus driver told that after driving the electric bus, she was able to save some amount of money, and with that money, she was able to actually educate her child. And apart from that, there
Right.
are today services like Blue Smart, and Delhi government has partnered with them, and they are also training, women drivers for that. And
Correct.
the last thing I would here mention is that even Anshuman mentioned the same thing, that today, in the coming few years, we all will be working in the climate economy. We agree it or not, doesn't matter. We are in the bank sector, does not matter where we are today. So while Nalin, I also want to understand this thing today from you, that, we agree that, okay, there are funds, we agree that we need great talent coming in, but how do we actually shorten the distance from talent and funds? Like, okay, these are the funds available, but the talent coming in, sometimes they're just so much into technology, they do not know what are the ecosystems available, or what are the funds available to support them. So is there a way we can actually shorten that gap? So probably Nalin can start, and Akhilesh, you can add on to that.
Sorry, the question is shorten which
Shorten
particular.
the distance, because one thing I have been hearing, like I often get a lot of these calls from entrepreneurs ki, hey Shweta, can you connect me with a probable investor, can you connect me? So, and like everyone
Right.
just comes and says literally the same thing, that we are looking for funds,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
looking
yeah.
for investors. But like I
Yeah,
sometimes feel surprised that, because I am on the both ends, I'm in with connect
sure,
with investors, and on the other hand with entrepreneurs. So is
sure.
there a way we can shorten that distance? Akhilesh, if you have some
Yeah, yeah.
points, probably you can also start with.
Sure, Akhilesh,
Yeah,
I'll
Akhilesh,
follow.
go forward.
I think one thing we need to understand is innovation can't be planned. That's one of the. It's very organic.
Yeah.
It can come from any quarters. Need not. It's not necessarily that the breakthrough inventions come from established players or the best research universities. History has taught us this. If the classic example is the aeroplane, right? The Wright brothers came up with it. They were the least likely to invent this. It's actually an open competition, and somebody from the Smithsonian Museum, I forget, but an aviation engineer with millions of dollars pumped in by the U.S. government was supposed to win that and make a flyable thing, but it didn't. It came from two amateurs building a prototype in their garage. So this is characteristic of innovation. It can come from any quarters. It's messy. It did not come from the most funded or the most competent people. Right now, this has always been the classic problem. How do you scale innovation? How do you, in your words, how do you bridge the gap?
Bridge the gap,
Um,
right?
and it's there's no mathematical you can't say if you do this and then okay, those causal relations don't work. But what we can do is build the necessary environment that can engender, that can nurture such possibilities. And on the bedrock, as Nalin said, is good higher education, good higher technical education with a focus on skill-based learning.
Skill
This
based
is
learning.
very important. If you look at the classical California Y Combinator kind of thing, a lot of this has been built on the bedrock of good universities. So I think great an investment in that really helps. One, but then it's just not that. You need the necessary environment for people to come in. In India has the benefit of a very youthful population and
Yeah.
significant number of them going into a technical education. So I think that really helps vis-a-vis other countries. Then, of course, you need the investors who are willing to take the risks, who come from and mentors in the network of mentors who come from this background. Right now, I see most investors in this space typically tend to be HNIs who've made it rich in real estate and something else. They don't really understand the DNA of entrepreneurship, typically climate entrepreneurship. I think that has to change. If you see many more successful entrepreneurs going, Nandan Nilekani is a great example. Somebody who's done it, who's been there. And so their perspectives of funding, startups with a greater risk profile, their understanding of this is better. And you see that happening in Bangalore, for example. Yeah. So the first generation of entrepreneurs in Bangalore, the Infosys and all the other IT companies, today these guys are actually investing. They're very good angel networks, is very good VC, domestic VC for these. And that's really encouraging. And I think those ecosystems need to be built. Can the government do it, or is it organic? I think a bit of both.
Yep.
And we can discuss this. I don't want to make this too long, but these are some initial thoughts.
Nalin, what would you add to that?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess if funding is the key thing that's stopping growth, then this question, of course, has greater meaning, right? Oftentimes, a lot of startups that we will see in the space will be perhaps not the unicorn types, but what we call zebras, like solid cash flow businesses that are perhaps national or regional, right? And many of them, we were speaking to one startup yesterday that is completely bootstrapped hardware, by the way. Huh? Hardware in the government space, completely bootstrapped, so it's possible. It's not that it's not possible. If climate capital or climate tech capital is what's stopping further growth, of course we need easier ways for startups and investors to engage, right? I mean, many people are trying to solve this problem, right? There are increasingly lots of essentially matching marketplaces. Some are using, matching AI ML to match. What we find, of course, useful is to increase the frequency of engagements, right? What it does is rather than doing, let's say, a pitch day every 6 months or once in a year or something, a big one, we rather focus on smaller pitch days but more frequently. So you can see many more startups. You can see the vibrancy in the space. And again, I'm only focusing where I have some insights, which is early stage, right? I'm sure there's many things in the late stage that can be done. So more frequent engagement, perhaps smaller engagements, more informal engagements as well, right? Because education and awareness is both sides, right? Investors, yes. It's especially in deep tech, climate tech, there's a lot of actual tech and domain expertise required, right? So also something that we want to explore is having kind of informal roundtables, almost like AMAs, where sure, I mean, you can ask the VC as an entrepreneur questions, but in fact, the VC can also ask questions. Like, I'm interested in understanding what does the electrochemical storage technology pathway look like across ABC, right? Across lithium, let's say, or across sodium and across redox and all of that, right? Entrepreneurs can come in, have an hour chat. It's literally an informal setting, right? And that kind of engagement is probably, it's less forbidding. It's you're there to learn. Both sides are there to learn, and then you get to know each other better. Again, early stages, a lot depends on founding teams. A lot depends on the dynamic and relationship between the investor and the teams. So all these things help. So of course we need many things like this. On the more kind of the almost like the modalities of this, I think what we are seeing is just the increasing use of convertible notes. There's a new in convertible notes, which kind of makes it easier to actually close deals. You're not getting into valuation at too early stages. The more standardized contracts. So again, I don't want to get too much into this. That's almost like a technicality, but it really helps in kind of closing deals faster. So the first aspect is how do you match better. The second aspect is how do you close better.
So, Nalin, like what you actually mentioned, like it really struck chords with me. And this is something that we are also trying to solve, because like I came across the same challenges. Like my experience has been talking to people who have been working on ground. So like I think that's definitely important. And also, Akhilesh, coming back to the things that you were talking about, education, more skill based learning, I think in the report also you mentioned that the growth and success of these startups actually goes beyond finance, climate finance. So let's like really touch upon the points that how can non-financial systems, or how can non-financial institutions, or what are, say, some of the non-financial things that we need to do as an ecosystem to support these startups.
Sure. As I said, I think education plays a vital role,
Yeah.
especially since most entrepreneurs tend to be younger.
Hmm.
Their ability to take personal risks early on is significantly larger than maybe when they have families, kids, and so on. So I think the entire university model has to change. In fact, it is already significantly. And I mentioned that we need to move towards a skill-based learning as
Yep.
opposed to a very older, perhaps what we were educated in, textbook-based, the textbook and lab-based. But I think at least I'm seeing a lot of universities not just do many more projects, but also do problem solving. So they get credits for a very specific problem that students have to solve, a problem that's very relevant in the industry, for example, right? So there's much more enmeshing between industry and academics, and I think that has to deepen. You can't have academics built on a monistic model of the 1500s, where the Oxford and Cambridges were walled off, and people went into study. That's gone. So I think that's the bedrock, at least the way I see it. It's very, very important. The first, the second thing, which I also mentioned a little earlier, is network of mentors, and you need mentors, especially the younger people. They really need access to good quality mentors,
Yes.
not just on the technical topics that they're trying to solve. That's certainly needed, but also on what I'd like to say is emotional intelligence.
Mm.
How do you work with teams? Very often I've seen two or three founders coming together, building a great product. They have a great idea, they have the passion individually, but somehow they just don't gel together
Yep.
as a team, and they break up, and then the idea is gone there. So I think that cohesiveness and the ability to look at the larger
Mm.
picture than small term immediate gains in terms of, okay, how much do I get funded? When can I sell the company, become a millionaire, and then I'm fine? That attitude, I think, I see it very, very much so in younger people. So
Mindset, you would say,
yeah,
building that mindset.
very much. And so that it's not easy work building a company, right? It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of effort. And so that kind of an intelligence, emotional intelligence, especially between founders, is extremely important. So I don't know if you can have trainings on this. Maybe somebody better position can answer it. But how do we start really bringing this into accelerators, incubators, and so on? That
So
could be an
we
interesting
have
point.
we do this actually, like quite early on, like when we started, like probably when I entered the space, I had no role models to look at. Like everywhere I was just reading about, okay, someone has created something, but no one actually talked about how they built what they have built. And the mindset you're talking about, so we do it through conversations. Like for example, how two founders came together, how they stood together with each other when nothing seemed to work, when the company was breaking down, or what mindset helped them do that. So we do through that, through the power of story. Even in your case, I think Akhilesh and Nalin, you two have had an incredible journey, and I don't think that journey has been easy for either of you. For example, Akhilesh, you writing the report, it's not like a one day task कि आज सोचा कल सुबह report बन के तैयार और परसों publish भी कर दिया है. It takes efforts, it takes that inner inspiration to write that. And Alan, similarly for you. So I would just like take this conversation in a slightly different angle, and I would like to understand from both of you that what has been your personal motivation to be in this space, to actually like face every challenge that comes your ways and do not give up. So Nalin, like let's start with you for this.
Okay. Um, I mean, for me, actually, I've been in this space, in the clean tech space, actually, for the last more than 15 years. I knew very early on, actually, right, in my third year of university, that I wanted to essentially marry my interest in engineering. So I'm an engineer by choice, not by design. In fact, I have always enjoyed working with machines since I was young. I used to break everything apart,
Yep.
when I was young and put them back together, thankfully, also. So I wanted to marry that interest with development. So I got interested in sustainable development. I secured in my last year, or my penultimate year perhaps, of university a small grant from the UN to essentially do rural electrification through solar. That became a multi-year project. Then we published a paper in 2007 on using essentially offshore wind electricity to produce hydrogen for India's transport sector. Of course, there was no hydrogen economy to speak of then, but increasingly we're seeing much more of that now. So my interest has been in this space for a long time, and I believe that's critical because
Yes.
Akhilesh alluded to this. A little while ago that this is any not just climate, anything is a struggle in many ways, because you have to stick with it for a while. That's the main thing. And increasingly as I get older, I realize that one of the key skills one needs to have is long-term commitment to something, and perhaps it's a recognition of something that people tend to do, but it's just something you recognize as you get older. Um, but if you're not interested in something, you will not be committed to it for the long term. That's very clear, right? So interest in this, and not being opportunistic is fine, but
Yep.
you have to have real interest in this because this
Yes.
presents sometimes greater challenges than other sectors. Gestation periods are longer, sales cycles are often longer, all of those things. Development times are longer, all of those things, which is something that people have to get used to. So having said that, I mean, just to complete, we were entrepreneurs before we came into, I mean, we are still entrepreneurs, but we were entrepreneurs in the clean energy space before this. We built about 84 megawatts of wind and solar between 2010 and 2015, the same team, same founding team, Pratap, Pramod, myself, and then Zui has become a fourth partner with us. Now, on the innovation side, we moved from the clean energy side to the broader climate innovation side. So the commitment has been there for a while, and I enjoy it. It's fine. The struggle will always be there in anything, but I think
Just
one has to enjoy it.
one follow-up question before we move to Akhilesh. While you were doing hydrogen, I think that during that point of time, you were a bit ahead of time. Like people were not talking about these things. Like, these things have
Right.
only come into the picture right now.
Correct.
So how did you stick to it? Like, with people around you calling you crazy, ki, why are you doing this? No one is talking about it. There are other things that people are talking about right now.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'll tell you, people always call you crazy. I really don't listen to them. Like 3 years ago, I co-produced a feature film. That is not part of my, it's not part of my training, not part of my, and that film is doing well. It's gone to Rotterdam, it's gone to several other festivals.
Wow.
But I think it's something that is just part and parcel of being an
Yes.
entrepreneur. And you have to do things differently. I have to, at this point, credit my parents who are very forward looking and very kind of liberal minded folks.
Yes.
So there was no clean energy economy to speak of when I went to study clean energy or sustainable energy. But things worked out. I came back. A year later, India introduced the solar policy, and things fell into place. Timing is important, but you cannot do anything about timing.
Yep.
It's not in your control. So there has to be the ability to see opportunity and take that opportunity and stick to that, and create opportunity also. It's not that something will happen, but end of the day, you're creating skills as an
Yes.
individual, and this is all even for young people who are now in the growth phase, and everyone's in the growth phase, by the way. But you're creating skills, you're compounding skills as you go along. You're compounding your ability to gather more knowledge and use that knowledge better. If a particular sector doesn't work out, you'll find another sector to apply your knowledge. But in fact, this is the right decade for someone who wants to be in climate tech, right? It just happens
Yes.
to be we are in the right time. The last 10 years were okay, but this decade is going to be much better for
Yep.
anyone who wants to be in the sector and wants to grow their skills in this sector.
Well said, Nalin, and thank you for taking all those steps of courage that you take. Coming straight away to Akhilesh. Akhilesh, I'm seeing that you have been thinking for a while now. So, like, tell me that what has your journey and what have been your challenges in doing what you're doing today? Was it like very easy, like, cakewalk kind of thing? You want to do something, you just created something. Or were there challenges?
And Nalin said he was an engineer did he say
By
choice or did
choice,
by
Choice
choice?
by
For me,
design.
it was the opposite.
not by design, yeah.
For me, it was the only thing that was available in my social milieu. That's what people did. They either became doctors or they became engineers. And being born, raised in Bangalore, and graduating from engineering, in the early 2000s, in the sort of the peak of the IT boom. I mean, we were getting like 3, 4 offers right out of college. So that's it's just what people did. But I think so, and I did join a large engineering company, and I did software for 3 years. But then it was just not me, and I think that's when I decided I can either do this, and I saw people who were like group managers who had spent 20 years in the same organization, and I looked at them and I asked myself honestly, is that what I want to be in 20 years? And the answer was clearly no. I mean, they were just functional, but I don't know if they were alive from inside, and I didn't want to be that. So I think I took a very drastic step, and I actually got off IT engineering, core engineering, and did something that I was really, really passionate about since I was a child, which is environment. I just love the environment. I love the natural world, animals, plants, trees, ecosystems. And I had a deep understanding just because of what I used to read of how humans impacted the ecosystem. And so I obviously wanted to build on my engineering. So that's when I decided to go to university again, reskill myself in a completely different environmental science and engineering. That was really the sort of the breakup, the divergent point of divergence for me. And so it was a choice, but the choice which was sort of based on inner compulsions, which we don't control, our inner natures. That's who we are. So I guess your question with regards to challenge, I think everybody faces challenge. Me, Nalin, or we're no different. I mean, every human being faces challenge, but the challenge, sort of dims in its intensity when you love what you do,
Yes.
because the love for what you do overpowers the challenges, and the challenges just become one hurdle for you to grow through curiosity and interest in something that you really love. So I think that connecting to that part is what keeps me personally going, and I love what I do. So uh, I don't really see the challenges then.
And you know how beautiful that feeling is, that living with that feeling every day what you're doing. So my last question to you, both of you, would be that in the clean tech space, actually, are there any models, like for example say international models, that personally inspire you and you feel that there are some learnings that we can like take from them? Or like what are your like thoughts on this? Because Akhilesh, you have seen like both like the Indian system and now being there also, you've seen both the systems from depth also, and similar for Nalin. So Akhilesh, like let's start with you actually.
I don't know if it's better or worse. I mean, we're talking about two completely different countries,
Hmm.
different socio-political, historical.
Yep.
So it's very different. I think it would be
Hmm.
unfair to make that comparison.
Comparison, right?
Uh, yeah, but I think the just I mean, for example, the US where I'm right now is just far more developed. The
Hmm.
startup ecosystem is far more developed. But as an Indian, when I look at what India was 10 years ago and what it is today, I think several pieces of the puzzle have already fallen together. Right?
Yes.
You've had decent. So at a macro level, you've had decent political stability for the last 2 terms of the current government, but also the previous government. You had very forward-looking policies. In fact, you trace that back to the reforms in '91, right? So we've had decent political stability for so long, which is so important, which we overlook. You just have to look at countries at war, Ukraine, for example. And how can you talk about any entrepreneurship without political stability, social stability? So I think that's very important. And we have it. That's really good. But over the last few years, I think the government, particularly, and we say this in the report, has done a good job of putting in the policies, especially Startup India. I think that has gone a long way in, if not turning startups to unicorns, but at least creating that ecosystem which I mentioned,
Ecosystem. Yeah.
and creating a consciousness within young entrepreneurs, just university graduates, final year, and so on, to consider getting into startup as a viable career option, which was not when I graduated in the early 2000s. That in itself is a great achievement. The results of this we may not see in the next 1, 2, 3 years, but this, there tends to be a lag, and we'll see the fruits of these right decisions in the next decade or so. And I'm pretty hopeful.
Yes.
I'm an optimist in that sense.
Very correctly said. Nalin, what are your thoughts?
Uh, I mean, I would echo what Akhilesh has already said. I think he's taken a pretty comprehensive look at this. Okay, there are many, and we can take inspiration from many, but I think we need to design something that's very much adapted for India, right? Okay, I'll tell you
Yeah.
why I say that, right? So the EU has a relatively successful climate tech model, right? But it's also driven by a top-down approach. The state can allocate a lot of resources, right? In India, perhaps we have different constraints. The state has many competing priorities, right? Of course, climate is one of them, but perhaps the level of allocation cannot be because our welfare needs are much higher, for example, right? So, what is needed here is a new model that's as scalable, but it's scalable at low cost. That is essentially um, private sector supplementing state capacity as well, right? And perhaps even driving things that and essentially working together versus it being a largely top-down approach. So here's where we feel an ecosystem approach, an integrated ecosystem approach, is gonna be useful, right? Now, an ecosystem approach again can be driven by the government. Singapore does a good job of this, right? You have Enterprise Singapore, you have EDB, you have the university and TUNNUS university ecosystem that do a great job of developing, research and development and commercializing deep tech into products, right? Now, of course, Singapore has many advantages, and it's not a good analogy for us, right? Now, having said that, I'm going to constantly contradict myself because there's always two sides of the same, two sides of a coin. Now, what Singapore, we often, say that we can't emulate what Singapore has done, sure, but Indian states and cities are their own political entities and they have massive powers themselves,
Yep.
right? So there's potential for states to take a lead here, as I was initially saying as well. But the ecosystem approach is important for private sector and the public sector to work together for there not be a need for top-down approach, right? California is also interesting, of course, as we know, right? The West Coast has taken a lead, especially in clean energy and increasingly in climate tech. The key reason for that is a lot of research money and publicly driven research money was funneled there. The space program led to a lot of innovation that then was commercialized by innovators and made into companies. Semiconductor research also in the early days, right? So you had again the state pumping in money to fund research. That was also a top-down approach. In India, we might take a different approach, right? It'll be much more of a collaborative approach, the
Yeah.
state and private sector working together. So we need to take what we can from there, which is a focus on research, which is a focus on supporting innovators. The way we do that may be quite different, right? So we take cues from the high level things, and the implementation could be our own design.
Well said, Nalin, and thank you to both of you for being here. And yes, the report is good. Yes, like the things that we need and we're working towards it. But on the other hand, I would just like to to both of you as well, like thank you for taking steps of courage and doing what you're doing, because the steps that you took maybe 10 or 20 years ago from today are really helping us strengthen the Indian climate entrepreneurial ecosystem, because the expertise, the experience, the learnings you bring to the table, and today the way you are strengthening the entire ecosystem, it's amazingly amazing. So thank you for doing what you do, and I genuinely mean it. Like Nalin and Akhilesh, thank you so much, and thank you for being with us here today.
No, it's a pleasure. And thank you for doing this. It's very important to keep this communication going with the
Yeah,
community, for sure.
thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. Thank you very much.